Steve, I promise I'm going to be pretty quick here. Just a couple of questions. First off, many of our civil liberty problems seem to stem from our border enforcement problems. For example, in the ports, in the seaports and the airports, you have extremely high security. Nobody who's not supposed to be there is going to go through those ports or the airports. But on the Mexican border, they're running across the border. This is resulting in drones now being deployed against, apparently here in the United States, at least that's what we were reading the other day. And these crazy policies suspecting every American of being a terrorist. If you're controlling your border to begin with, you don't have those problems, and you can ease off this nonsense. That's the first observation. The second is, I have a question as to how effective the House can be, absent the Senate, as a check and balance against unbridled presidential power. Because the way, according to at least my understanding of it, we have the Senate refusing to question anything that Obama does. I mean, there's nothing that he can do that they'll question. They're just a rubber stamp. So in the House, you go and you can pass all these laws and you can hold all these hearings, but what real practical effect do you have as a check against unbridled presidential power?
It's it's an important point to bring up because you can't always tell, but there are some areas where I've seen some changes because of the oversight function. I think one area that Congress has not utilized enough, and I think we've gotten fairly aggressive about in the last year, is having more oversight, bringing cabinet secretaries in, bringing people even under those cabinet secretaries, where you're hearing about problems. And I mean, when I get to come back home, not only do I hold town hall meetings, but I also get to go and sit down with business people, sit down with families that are dealing with all these rules and regulations and federal agencies, and see what's working and what's not working. And when we hear a lot about things that aren't working the way they're supposed to be working. And I get to go back up to Washington and share that with my colleagues, and I'll sit on the oversight subcommittee of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. For example, on energy policy, we've had big problems since the Macondo well, where the Obama administration's changed policy on permitting, let people go back to work. And people that had great safety records. This isn't about safety versus jobs. People that were doing everything right, that didn't have the problems that BP had, and they still can't get consistent permits even to this day. So we started having a lot of hearings in public hearings. These are hearings that have been on C-SPAN and other places, where the public has gotten to see and shown a lot of transparency on just what's going on and how it's killing jobs. And we've started to see an increase. It's not the increase that we need. It's surely not where we were pre-Macondo, but at the same time, we finally started to at least address the problem and get some movement. Not enough movement that I'd like to see, but surely more movement than if we didn't have the hearings. Fast and Furious. I don't sit on Darrell Issa's committee, but Darrell Issa, who chairs the Government Oversight Committee, has had a lot of aggressive hearings. I think done a great job of exposing some things that everybody ought to know about. Fast and Furious is one of those, and he's really just getting started in that series of hearings on Fast and Furious. We went and covered a lot of stuff. I sit on the subcommittee where we had hearings on Solyndra. We started hearing about this loan scandal in the Department of Energy. And so we looked into it, and initially we had hearings. We asked the White House for documents, and they didn't give it to us. So we said, okay, we're going to subpoena you. We have that power. We did it. We had a vote. We had an actual record vote. And a lot of people on our committee voted against it. The majority of our committee voted yes to subpoena the White House, and we got some documents that we didn't have before that actually led us to even more places. And there's a major investigation going on right now into that where over $535 billion in taxpayer money was blown. And so you wouldn't have those if you didn't have the oversight. Again, a lot more that needs to be done. And look, if Barney Franklin was chairman of the banking committee back a few years ago, would have actually done his job on oversight, and started looking into what Fannie and Freddie were doing, we would have exposed a lot of this before you had the meltdown. But instead, he was actually defending them. It's on video. You can go see him saying, leave Fannie and Freddie alone. And they left them alone. And look what happened. And so, where Congress has done its job, you've at least gotten to see transparency, where we can see what the facts are, and we need to continue doing more of that.
What does this have to do on the war on American citizens that he asked about? He asked about drones, he asked about securing the border, and he asked about the TSA. I mean,
he asked about a lot of those things. Well, clearly, and I said earlier, I was very strong earlier, even said in relation to this last gentleman's question about a number of things, including border security. We're not doing enough, and we need to do more to secure the border of the United States, especially in Mexico, where we know people are jumping across every single day. The federal government's not enforcing the laws that are on the books. We need to do more. And if a state like Arizona says, look, if you're not doing your job, we want to protect our state and our citizens, they ought to be able to do that. And right now, the federal government's trying to block them from doing that. So, clearly, not enough's being done.
Do you recognize that the government is preparing to wage a war against American citizens?
We're going to be able to take these last three, and then we're going to need to wrap up.
Yes, sir.
My name is John Cunningham. I am a former educator of this area. Graduated from Seminole in '99. I'm from Washington, D.C., so I'm involved in education for about 20 years. And the one thing that is not being discussed on a much greater level, a lot of the problems that we are facing is just a basic thing that happens in the morning when you look in the mirror. And are you actually trying to do the job that you are being paid to do? Not you. I'm just saying you understood. Because when I look at these children that I have taught from various social economic status and races and creeds, is the adults in their lives, from the government, from the world, the government, and their families, are letting them down. Because we are not spending enough time on integrity. I can tell you one thing, for instance, happened when I went to the Veterans Home in Reserve. The American Legion came there the same day that my character building club that I sponsor was there. And they claimed they were there to give a gift to the veterans, like a shirt that had the American flag and showed so much patriotism. But they took pictures with those veterans, and as soon as those pictures were taken, they left. And the look on those veterans' faces was like, this is a microcosm of our country. We say one thing and we do another. Until that gets fixed, none of these problems that we're talking about are going to even begin to see any results. And one last thing. In our country, education is a major issue and security is a major issue at our schools. A lot of our children do not feel safe to go to school. And if I don't feel safe, I'm not going to want to be educated. Because, the first rule of the AMP team is survival. And if I can't survive, then there's nothing else. So I would just want to, when you go back to Washington, my hometown, please let your constituents or your fellow colleagues know that they're being watched. A lot of the children I deal with, they don't have C-SPAN, their internet connection, they're looking at YouTube, but they're not looking at anything dealing with what's going on around them, are looking for a security, a safety net. And without it, they have no future. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the work that you do to help be a role model and motivate our young people. Clearly, we need to do more of that. I don't think the federal government is best served to run education systems. I think it's local and state governments that run their education systems. I think Louisiana did a really good job this year in passing some landmark reforms to education. I was real involved. I was on the board of Teach for America back before I was in Congress, both before and after Katrina. And what we saw is a lot of people get involved in helping reform a system that was completely failing kids. I mean, you had tens of thousands of kids every year going through a system that was just failing them. When you had a kid that graduated that was a valedictorian of high school, couldn't pass the state exit exam. That means that child did everything that they were asked to do. The system failed. They were miserable. And so when we made some major reforms, including charter schools where communities got more involved, it really had a dramatic impact, and it's been great to see. Clearly, more needs to be done, but I think where you encourage more local involvement, it's worked much better than when you've got top-heavy and especially federal involvement trying to tell local people how to run schools. So I think what you're doing is great. More people need to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, this won't take me long. First off, I'd like to do just a couple of quick clarifications. Number one, the HC 107 was pointed out was the North Carolina Walter Jones representative that put it forward, and it was just stating that after Leon Panetta spoke with Congress and said that the UN, basically, he implied that the UN had authority over the War Powers Act. And his resolution he put forward just suggests that if in the future Congress wasn't looked to for their approval to go to war like in Libya or Syria, that then impeachment proceedings would come forward. Secondly, there's a federal judge that has recognized the threat of the indefinite detention portion of the NDAA and has ruled it unconstitutional, as well as legislators in the states of Arizona and Virginia have said they would not participate if the federal government did indeed try to indefinitely detain American citizens. So those are two state legislators and a federal judge. That seems a threat inherent there. Then other than that, I just have two quick questions. Number one is, would you consider voting for an audit the Fed bill that may be coming up in July, sponsored by Ron Paul? And the other question would be having to further have to do with international treaties with the UN. So there's a couple of UN treaties that have been agreed to, including CISPA as far as internet censorship bill, and I'm guessing like any support that you would have for CISPA would have to do with intellectual property rights, and I'm wondering if that is your main motivation for voting for CISPA. And then secondly, is the United Nations Agenda 21, which you can look up at the UN website, which basically gives international boards like broad authority over private property rights in the name of sustainable development. And I urge you all to go to UN website and look up Agenda 21 and how much implication there is there for rights over your property and over your rights.
I appreciate the questions and the comments. First, in general, in relation to the United Nations, not only do I strongly oppose the United Nations have any kind of say over U.S. troops, U.S. laws, I'm against law at sea, I'm against anything that the UN's trying to do to come in and tell us what to do.
Right, it says that in our platform, the Louisiana platform.
But in fact, we had an amendment last year on the appropriations bill to completely defund the United Nations. I think it goes way beyond the things that they're proposing. The United Nations has become a very anti-American and anti-Semitic organization. They're very anti-Israel. A lot of their countries that are active in the United Nations are very anti-American and have made very strong statements. They brought proposals before the UN that are really not only undermine American national security, but a lot of the other things that we stand for, and yet we're funding them and we're housing them in New York, and they get diplomatic immunity. If they want to go spout off radical beliefs, let them do it in another country without our taxpayer money. And so I voted to completely defund the United Nations because I think they just got Now, as it relates to the audit the Fed bill, I think I mentioned earlier, I'm a co-sponsor of the audit the Fed bill. In fact, I think it was about a year ago, we were, I think probably not long after Ron Paul filed the bill, we were getting asked at some of the public meetings we were going to, where people said, what's your thoughts on HR, the bill number for audit the Fed? We went and looked it up. And when we looked it up, this bill makes a lot of sense. It's something we ought to be doing. And I signed on as co-sponsor and went and talked to Ron Paul on the House floor about it back then. Just talked to him again last week, and the bill got out of committee, passed out of committee. And his goal is to have it come up for a vote on the House floor very soon in the next few weeks. And I hope he's able to get that vote on the House floor. Because I think we ought to have, not only we ought to audit the Fed, but we ought to see who's for and against auditing the Fed. I'm a co-sponsor of the bill, and I hope it passes, goes over to the Senate, but I also think it's important to have that vote to see who's against auditing the Fed, because they're out there committing this country, taxpayers, to trillions of dollars. We don't even know what they're doing because they've never been audited, and they ought to be audited. Once they're audited, at least we can see what's going on over there. And if there are problems we need to address, then we can do it. But we don't even know what they're doing right now. So it ought to happen. I'm a co-sponsor of the bill, but I also, as Ron Paul said, he feels real confident we'll have a vote on the House floor in the next few weeks on that bill.
So you don't recognize the international bodies that have authority over the war powers?
Absolutely not. In fact, we had a big disagreement with President Obama over the operations in Libya. I felt that the War Powers Act was not followed. A number of us did. We brought legislation to force the president to follow the war powers, and if he's going to engage, surely don't cede to foreign countries But also, you got to go to Congress under the law. If you're going to continue to engage in a foreign conflict, then you have to go to Congress to get permission, just as George W. Bush did for Iraq. Follow the War Powers Act. So,
We want you to have your constitutional power.
Thank you.
Instead of the Constitution. Don't let
So
us
what-
go to war without what it says right here.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying.
right there. Yes, sir.
Congressman Scalise, I'd just like to say thank you very much for extending the opportunity to everybody in the room for being here and taking our questions. And I have two questions. One is pertaining to House Resolution 3806. It's known as the One Subject at a Time Act. It was introduced on January 22nd. It was introduced on January 22nd this year. It's sponsored by Thomas Marino. Are you familiar with this bill?
I haven't looked at that bill, but we haven't looked at it.
3806. It's very simple. It's One Subject at a Time Act, clarifying some of the mess that we have in the Congress with multiple agendas tagged onto one piece of legislation. And moving on from there to the second question, the National Defense Authorization Act has been brought up and thoroughly discussed today. And do you see that due process? Do you personally, outside of any of your vote, as you understand the bill, do you think it derives, or does it deprive the citizens of their due process? And
Okay,
follow-
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Just go ahead if you can.
Article 1, Section 8, and if you do think it does deprive the citizens of their due process, I ask you, where do you derive your enumerated power to do that? Because it's in violation of Article 1, Section 8, clearly.
Well, I talked to, not only did I read the bill, but I also talked to constitutional scholars, because this is an issue. I'm a member of the House Republican Study Committee. It's just a group of conservative members of the House that every week we meet, we discuss issues that are moving through Congress, different policy issues that we'd like to implement. We talk thoroughly through those, especially as it gets to issues that are very controversial, where there's big divisions. We have extended debate about, real extended debate about NDAA and, whether or not due process is being followed, and especially as it relates to the various amendments to clarify or to go in a different direction on habeas corpus. And so we had not only extensive debates between members of Congress, and there were, Justin Amash presented his amendment, Jeff Landry and Louis Gohmert presented their amendment. We had a real active discussion on it, but we also talked to constitutional lawyers as well. And not everybody's in agreement, but, and again, we may agree on parts of it, we may disagree on parts of it, and, the courts are going to ultimately decide, but I felt confident, especially when we added the language from Louis Gohmert and Jeff Landry's amendment, that American citizens and their rights under habeas corpus are completely upheld, and the constitutional rights that people have. Again, Congress can't take away by statute constitutional rights. Somebody would have to change the Constitution, and nobody's proposed doing that. So ultimately, you're dealing with a law, and we put language in to reiterate that those rights will be upheld for American citizens. So we had a healthy debate on that. I think both sides got to air it out. Didn't mean at the end of the day everybody was in agreement. Clearly, Amash and others still want to know what their approach, but most members felt that we did the right thing and made sure that American citizens, their rights were strongly reinforced, but at the same time, if somebody was a foreign terrorist and they came here, they don't get those rights that American citizens have. So that was the process, again, days and days of discussion about this amongst a lot of different people.
Could just a follow-up to read a quote from Lindsey Graham. And to those American citizens thinking about helping Al-Qaeda, when they say, I want my lawyer, you tell them, shut up, you don't get a lawyer. You familiar?
Well, there's a lot of things I disagree with Lindsey Graham about,
And
what he said there is just not the case, and that may have been, there was a Senate, by the way. In the Senate, they actually had language at one point that tried to take those rights away. And Lindsey Graham may have been talking about a Senate version, which was very different than the final version we voted for in the House. So please keep that in context too, because if Lindsey Graham was making comments about the Senate version of the bill, then I agree with Lindsey on the things that the Senate was trying to do that we did not do in the House. And in fact, we restated those constitutional rights in the Gohmert-Landry amendment, which I would suggest anybody to read. And once you read that, I think we feel confident that not only are those rights restated, but now that's part of law. That's actually been signed into law.
Thank you for your time.
Sure, thank you. Your last question.
Okay, I hope you can hear it to hold the thing up like I think it should be done. Where?
Why did you do a demo at the start?
I've tried, for some reason or other, he didn't want to hold it like this, so. Everybody's got something to say. I got 2 minutes. All I want to do is talk about the post office department. Post office department says they're running out of money. Well, they're running out of money because they're letting too much mail out for 2 cents up to 12 cents a piece. Anybody in this audience here got to pay 45 cents to mail a letter. Well, when I was growing up, I could mail a letter all over the U.S. for 3 cents. That's a bunch of baloney. There's no way of doing it now. If the post office would get the rates up to half of what a regular person pays, it would be 22 cents. It would sure as heck cut down all the junk mail that I'm getting, because I've gotten as much as 40 pieces in one day. And several times it's been over 1,000, over 30. And if they went around and upped the price from a nickel with 12 cents and made it 22 cents or half or whatever the going rate is, it would sure have cut down the amount of mail that the post office does, so it won't cost them so much to do it. They'll have plenty of money, and I won't have all this baloney I gotta go through. That's all.
That's probably a good note to end on. And at the end of the day, the post office has to stand on their own 2 feet. They should be subsidized by the tax.